Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Rev War Revelry. I am Dan Welch, and joining me this evening is Billy Griffith, one of ERW's very own. And tonight, Billy is going to kind of lead us through one of his earlier books that he published on a battle from the French and Indian War, the Battle of Lake George. Before we get started with our author spotlight and book interview tonight with Billy, I just want to point out a couple things to you this evening to pay attention for towards the end. We've got some updates about the fall bus trip for Emerging Revolutionary War to Valley Forge and the Battle of Monmouth, of which Billy Griffith will be one of our guides that evening. We got some information about our fall symposium, the Emerging Revolutionary War Symposium with Historic Alexandria. And last but not least, we've got some information about our upcoming revelry in 2 weeks. So we'll save all of that for the very end. And as always, if you have questions tonight, as we're making our way through what plans to be a very exciting and interesting evening, feel free to drop those in the chat for Billy as we go along. So Billy, welcome to another edition of ERW Revelry tonight. How are things down in Virginia this evening?
Things are going great down in Virginia. Went for a nice long walk at Manassas battlefield today on Henry House Hill, and got back just before the rain came.
That was fantastic. We've had nothing but rain up here in northeastern Ohio, so it was a great day to sit down with your book and to really get my eyes opened to an important moment in colonial history, particularly up in New England. So I want us to start with the context in which the Battle of Lake George will happen. Set us up, what's going on in the colonies with the English, the French, the Indians in 1754 into early 1755.
Yeah, well, to start off with the battle itself, to place it into, the timeline, it's fought September 8th, 1755. So this is the first full year of the French and Indian War, you can say, if you do, consider the firing or the shots fired at Jumonville Glen in May of 1754 by Washington and his Virginians to be the spark that ignites the war. It's one thing to keep in mind is that when this battle is fought, and also when the other famous battle of that year is fought, the Battle of Monongahela in July of 1755, war has not officially been declared between France and Britain at this point yet. It won't be for another year until the two countries are actually officially at war with each other. So this is really an undeclared war being fought in North America between 1754 and 1755, as both England and France are really trying to gather up everything that they believe that is rightfully theirs, i.e. land, waterways in North America, before an official war could be declared. So trying to oust the enemy before war begins. But to set the stage, as I mentioned, Washington is well known, is directly involved with firing the first shots of the French and Indian War at Jumonville Glen in May 1754. After that, in July, his force is going to capitulate at Fort Necessity against a much larger French-Canadian force. And it really won't be for another year or so before we see more military actions. And that's because both sides are really going to take a step back and determine what will be the next course. Both France and Britain are then going to determine that they need to send regular support, meaning regular troops, to the colonies to defend New France, as well as to defend the British colonies and capture any more land that they may put in their crosshairs. So in April of 1755, right in Alexandria, Virginia, so not far from here, at what's known as the Carlisle House, the new commander-in-chief of all British forces here in America, Major General Edward Braddock, is going to meet with the governors of several colonies from Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and they are going to discuss what aid that the colonies are going to give for this upcoming campaign that will hopefully oust the French from North America. And Braddock at the same time is going to come up with a plan to go against 4 military targets in North America. This plan is given directly to him from the Captain General of the British Army, that's the Duke of Cumberland. And his goals coming over here are to secure four major strongholds, and that is Fort Duquesne, right where Pittsburgh is today, at the Forks of the Ohio River, and also to capture Fort Niagara on Lake Ontario, to capture Fort Beausejour, which is up on the Chignecto Isthmus, which connects Nova Scotia with mainland Canada, as well as to capture Fort St. Frederick, which is today known as Crown Point, north of Fort Ticonderoga along Lake Champlain. So four armies are going to be mobilized to take these targets. Braddock is going to take the largest army of British regulars and colonial provincials and move against Fort Duquesne. We all know that he meets defeat outside of Duquesne at the Battle of Monongahela. William Shirley, the second in command of all British forces here, and the royal governor of Massachusetts, is going to command the expeditionary force that will try to take Fort Niagara. His attempt is going to stall at Fort Oswego, and he is not going to choose to continue on. So Fort Niagara will remain in French hands after the year. Fort Beausejour and Fort Gaspereau in Nova Scotia or Acadia, they are going to fall to an army commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton, which, to make a Monmouth connection here, Robert Monckton is actually the older half-brother of Henry Monckton, who's a British officer at the head of one of the Grenadier battalions at Monmouth, who was actually killed while fighting there and is currently buried not far from the Monmouth battlefield today. But that last army now, I should mention that both Fort Beausejour and Gaspereau do fall in June, really without firing any shots. So that's why when I argue with my book title, it's England's first triumph in the French and Indian War. While yes, Fort Beausejour and Gaspereau fall first, it really isn't a major pitched battlefield victory for the English. So that last army is going to be placed under command of William Johnson, who at the time is serving as the superintendent of Indian affairs for the northern colonies. He has no military experience prior to this, but he's going to be given the task of commanding a 3,000 man strong expeditionary force, troops from New England and New York, and he's going to march from Albany, cut a 60-mile length road through the wilderness to get to the southern shore of Lake George. And from there, he's going to use that as the springboard to then launch an offensive north on the lake to Lake Champlain to capture Fort St. Frederick.
So let's take a step back for a moment. So, really it's the late winter of 1754, early spring of 1755. We have a new theater commander, if you will, for the English arriving. Braddock is now here. You tell in the book, and I don't want to give too many parts of it away. I do want to tell folks that it's an excellent book that we're going to be talking about tonight. I forgot to mention the title, The Battle of Lake George. As Billy mentioned, the subtitle of the book, England's First Triumph in the French and Indian War. So Braddock arrives. He's this new theater commander, if you will, as you mentioned. He calls this meeting of the governors of the numerous colonies to meet in Alexandria, Virginia, at a location known as the Carlisle House. For folks not familiar with it, you can still go visit the Carlisle House today. It is run as a museum, so you can see where these events have taken place. Out of this meeting, as you were discussing, Braddock basically informs, if you will, although it invites some assistance, but informs the governors that he's got these four strategic objectives for the coming months, weeks and months of what's known as good campaign weather season, particularly the summer months of 1755. I think what was really interesting to come out of this meeting, and I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more, is Braddock basically tells the governors that this is what we're doing. These are the men that I need you to raise as far as numbers go. And these are the supplies that your colonies are going to need to furnish. Can you talk a little bit about the requirements that Braddock lays on not only the governors and the colonies themselves, but on these individual commands that are going to be set up for these four very disparate missions?
Yeah, so one thing brings up a good point, a good time to bring this up, is that a lot of the times in the historiography of Lake George, even general French and Indian War histories that I've read, when it comes to the battle, the colonial troops that are fighting are always described as militia. These are not these are militiamen. Nearly every man between the age of 16 and 60 is going to be serving in his town's militia at the time. But these are actually like, to use an example, like during the Civil War, these are, the state units that are being raised for a certain period of time. And during the French and Indian War, it's usually a campaigning season, to serve. They can serve outside the boundaries of the actual state. Militia do not leave the boundaries of their own state. So by forming these state units that are actually raised and equipped by the colonial assemblies, they can then operate as a much larger army and attach themselves as well to British regular forces that will be serving here. But yeah, the assemblies are going to be tasked with recruiting these men, and arming and equipping them. Anything else that's going to be needed, so transportation per se for all the supplies and all these troops, it's really going to be up to the private sector, that these generals are going to have to reach out to merchants to actually help finance these expeditions. And there's going to be a feud that does erupt between two of the generals in charge of these expeditions, William Johnson being one and William Shirley, where they're essentially going to be trying to steal the competition away from each other, to supply their forces, to see basically who can capture their objective first. And as we'll see, William Shirley does not accomplish anything, while Johnson at least does secure the southern end of Lake George. But you were talking about what I thought was interesting too, at the Carlisle Congress, that occurs in April 1755, the plan that Braddock is going to carry with him from the Duke of Cumberland basically tasks Braddock with capturing Fort Duquesne, and then from there turning northeast and assisting Johnson to capture Crown Point, and from there turning west to go assist Shirley with the capture of Fort Niagara. And this is all supposed to be done within the matter of a few months. Like, I think it's a perfect example, really, the British military hierarchies really just misunderstanding or total ignorance of the true nature of warfare here in North America. And this is a theme that the British Army is going to have to face and will have to adapt with great losses throughout the French and Indian War.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you bring up before you get into the battle that I thought were really interesting in the book, and that I would point folks to, not only the Carlisle Congress itself, the logistics that are going to be involved in this, as far as raising these troops, supplying these troops. You mentioned guys like Shirley and Johnson privately bankrolling some of these things. A lot of moving parts. And I think the biggest one that you just talked about was the British, misunderstanding of warfare in North America. And you really go into detail talking about how the French, the Canadian forces, the Indian forces that have aligned themselves with the French have a far clearer picture and expertise at moving into what you refer to as guerrilla warfare in North America than what the standard British or the regular British Army, these regiments of foot, are used to at this period of military history. So talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that as you're going into guerrilla warfare, where the unevenness is between these two disparate army groups, and how will that impact these coming campaigns, these coming individual 4 campaigns, if you will, within the broader strategic framework.
Yeah, it's a kind of a comparison of irregular tactics versus linear or regular style tactics. Obviously, like we see in the movies, very well of, these European armies coming here, the regular soldiers have been trained to fight in compact linear style formations in open field combat, closing into 60 yards of an enemy and leveling their muskets and firing away. Well, it's going to be much difficult to maneuver on a battlefield that's entirely covered with thick wilderness and undergrowth. So these British regulars, over the course of the years, it's entirely another discussion that we can do a Zoom for one time, but like the evolution of warfare during the French and Indian War. So eventually the British are going to, adopt light infantry companies. They're going to have a lot of their officers actually accompanying and learning from the colonial rangers, like Rogers Rangers. But for the most part, the French are going to have the upper hand at this early part of the war, because a lot of the Canadian militiamen that are going to be augmenting these French regular forces, as well as the Canadian Marines, which are essentially colonial regular forces, in New France. A lot of them have been operating in thick wilderness before. They've been fighting side by side with Native Americans, understanding that this is the better way to fight, to make the most of the terrain in your environment. That's why the Native Americans, really both sides early on in the war, the French understand that they are the key. They are the best wilderness fighters. They are the best scouts on either side in North America. The British don't necessarily understand this early on. Now, this is a really unique take or focus, we could say, with the Battle of Lake George, is that William Johnson does understand the importance of the Native Americans. It's always been said that Edward Braddock, really, he was very good at defending the Native Americans. It didn't see that they were necessary for his expedition towards Fort Duquesne. Although he does have about, I think, like 8 Native Americans that do actually accompany him eventually. But William Johnson is actually going to be able to recruit for his army words of like 200 Mohawk. He is very, very, very close with the Mohawks of the Mohawk River Valley in New York. He is very close to one of their sachems. His name is King Hendrick, and he was a Mohegan that was eventually adopted by the Mohawks in 1755. He's in his early 60s at this time, and he is very well traveled. Even in 1740, he went across the ocean and actually paid a visit to King George II. So he is known to the English affectionately as King Hendrick or Chief Hendrick, and he will be able to assist Johnson in recruiting Native American allies or auxiliaries for his expedition towards Fort St. Frederick.
One of the interesting things about that part of the story was the dynamic that you presented between Shirley and Johnson, basically fighting over trying to get Native American allies within their respective army groups, if you will, to carry out the campaign. And I think to the detriment to what will eventually happen with Johnson in his expedition towards Lake George. Can you talk a little bit about these two army groups, if you will, Shirley and Johnson, and the raising of those Native American allies? It's something that, as you mentioned, Johnson already favored or championed as necessary, but it's definitely something that the colonials and British are behind the ball with. As you mentioned, the French have been working with the Native Americans for a long time already. So can you talk a little bit about that dynamic between Shirley and Johnson and trying to raise these allies and rely on them in the coming campaigns?
Yeah, both of them, when it comes to their approach to the Native Americans too, Johnson is the one who really tries to take a more compassionate and open approach to raising them. He does, living amongst them, he does understand their customs, their practices, that, these are people. They are not just bodies that you're going to throw out onto the front lines. And he knows that they have their desires too for what needs to be obtained. And he knows that they have boundaries too, places they will not go, things they will not do. Shirley, on the other hand, is basically using any means possible to try to gain their support. And that even includes using corrupt, like, say, land speculators or merchants who have been known to cheat the Native Americans out of land that was rightfully theirs. So Shirley, a much different approach. And we'll see too, later on in the war, as the British begin to understand the Native Americans, like John Forbes, even William Pitt, they know that there needs to be an approach at all costs to get these Native Americans, and you're going to have to compromise. You're going to have to take losses in order to get their help, or at least let them remain neutral, so they do not go to the French aid.
So at this point in the narrative in your book, you've kind of established, the situation, the context in which all these events are happening. You've got Braddock here. You've got the governor's conference, the Carlisle Congress. They've established these 4 individual objectives for the coming campaign season. They're building their armies. I thought the chapter about the uniforms of these individual state units was fascinating. I've definitely come to appreciate the Jersey Blues after reading this book. It's definitely a unit that I was not familiar with before. But what I want to do now is before we get into the Battle of Lake George itself, is talk about and wrap up these 3 other objectives that were on the list. As you mentioned earlier, each one is under a different command. Each one has a different objective. I kind of want to wrap those stories up before we hear about what takes place at Lake George and why Lake George becomes so crucial for the English in the fall of 17 55 as a result of what's been going on with these other objectives.
Yeah, as I had mentioned earlier, Acadia, Fort Gaspereau, and Beausejour do fall in June, so fairly quickly. So that objective is secure, and after that begins what's known as the great expulsion of Acadian people. Upwards of 10,000 or something Acadians are going to be kicked out of their native lands and shipped elsewhere by the British, in what can be considered one of the first real ethnic cleansings in modern history. So Nova Scotia
And that's a
is,
pretty easy English victory, as you describe it.
yes, yeah, those forts fall really without any resistance. And then Shirley's campaign, as I mentioned, amounts to nothing. They get to Oswego. He sees that the fortification there, old trading post, is in such a dilapidated form that he needs to immediately begin reconstructing it and strengthening the works. And he will decide to not continue on with the expedition until hopefully the following year. But the Marquis de Montcalm the next year is going to end up assaulting Oswego before any of those troops can do anything, and that fort will end up falling, giving control of the Great Lakes really firmly to the French for that period. Braddock's defeat along the Monongahela in July 1755, that is a huge disaster, still considered today one of the worst disasters in British military history. That is going to have a really pronounced effect on the British cause in that year. In 1755, and this word of this defeat does reach Johnson's army. There are letters of men who know what has happened, and it's incredible because a lot of them too, while they feel some despair, they also understand, well, that's not us. We can still do something about this and turn it around. We have to focus on our objective. So it's going to have a huge effect on morale, and two, what Lake George, the victory there, it's going to prove, to the Americans who fight there. I'm going to use the term Americans, even though they're still colonists. This was an entirely American army of New England and New Yorkers. There's only one British officer, regular soldier, who actually serves with them within the ranks. His name is Captain William Eyre. He is of the 44th Regiment of Foot. So had Braddock not assigned him to the Johnson's expedition, he would have been right there on the Monongahela as well. But he is going to be serving as Johnson's quartermaster, as well as his chief of artillery and his chief engineer too. So basically doing all the jobs that the colonial provincials could handle. So when the American army here on the Johnson does eventually emerge victorious, this really is going to prove that the Americans mettle, that they can stand up and fight against the French army and their Native American allies, as they will hold the field by the end of the battle.
Now, Johnson's campaign is really late to start as compared to these other three objectives. As you mentioned, the actions with the Acadians up in Nova Scotia is already done and over with. The Oswego movement is already done and over with. Braddock's campaign towards the Monongahela has been defeated. It's done and over with. And it's not until about mid-July that Johnson really gets his army up and moving, if you will. He's had them coming together in Albany, and he's getting ready to set out. So set the stage for us. It's July of 1755, and Johnson's army is beginning to move out. And the earliest steps of the campaigns, what are their objectives? Where are they going? Who's with them? What forces is Johnson taking from them? What units do we see?
Yeah, so throughout the summer of 1755, Johnson's army is going to be organizing around Albany, and it is by the end of July that he's going to put forth the first foot towards getting to Lake George and Lake Champlain beyond. He's going to divide his army into two divisions. One will be under the command of his second in command, Phineas Lyman, who is a Connecticut man, and not jumping ahead, but he's probably the one who actually ends up leading the American army at the Battle of Lake George, because Johnson is wounded very early in the action. And then the second division will be commanded by Moses Titcomb, who is commander of the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, or provincials. But yeah, his army will consist of men from 3 regiments from Massachusetts, 2 from Connecticut, 1 from New York, even though 3 of its companies are actually from Connecticut, because New York couldn't meet the quota of raising enough men for multiple regiments. And then there will also be a unit from New Hampshire, as well as 1 from Rhode Island. Now, that New Hampshire unit is going to be left behind at what was essentially their forward operating base before the advance to Lake George, which is Fort Lyman. That Lyman is sent ahead to construct to serve as a base of operations and supply. And it will eventually be rechristened Fort Edward after the battle, which if anyone's familiar with, say, Last of the Mohicans or the Siege of Fort William Henry, Fort Edward probably rings a bell, only about 14 miles from the southern end of Lake George. So Lyman is going to be at the head, really, and he's going to build the road. They're going to have to widen this 60-mile road. They're going to have to improve it, cut down trees. They're going to have to obviously portage many of the creeks and waterways running through the area to get there. It's not an easy task, but this military road will be crucial for the French and Indian War that they build, as well as during the American Revolutionary War. It will be in continuous use by both the British and American armies. So by August, the end of August, the armies are going to start to congregate at the southern end of Lake George. And it's on August 28th that William Johnson himself is going to arrive there, and he is going to rechristen the lake as Lake George in honor of the king. Prior to that, the French name of it was Lac du Saint-Sacrement. So here, William Johnson is essentially declaring dominion for King George II.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned, I thought that was great in the book. And if you pick it up, folks, and you read it, he's got some wonderful firsthand accounts, eyewitness sources in there, which I can only imagine were a treat to find as you were researching this book. Some of them are very colorful and really bring to life those events. But one of the things that you pointed out was just before Johnson could even get this campaign off the ground is building this road in which the vast majority of his army can move, a road that can support them logistically with supplies, a road that can shuttle troops. And the way that you write about the construction of this road makes you realize that these guys are literally carving a path out of the wilderness to get to what will become this fort, Lyman. And Johnson was very specific. I mean, these guys are measuring off. Johnson wants the road so many feet wide. He wants so much done with the trees that come down. He wants all these particular things. So it's a lot of work to do in the middle of the wilderness under the constant threat of attack by the French and their allies. But they eventually make it to this area where Fort Lyman is going to be constructed. And with these guys that's laying out, these advanced units, if you will, that's laying out the construction of this fort, is this Captain William Eyre. Am I saying that correctly?
I think it's Eyre, like the book
Eyre?
Jane Eyre.
Jane
spelled
Eyre,
the same way.
Captain William Eyre. All right. So Captain William Eyre, who becomes a central figure in the story. And I think you pointed it out, but it's really interesting to focus on that he is the only British officer with this contingent out of these four different objectives that were created, these four different commands that are going forward. He's the only British officer with Johnson's men. He gets there, he lays out the fort. And why is the construction of what becomes Fort Lyman so critical to Johnson's overall objectives at this point? Why does he need that base there?
Yeah, as you see throughout all the French and Indian War, really the goal and mission for both sides is getting to strategic points such as waterways, which are the major highway systems in North America at this time in the 18th century, getting to these waterways and securing them by building a series of fortifications that you can have the forward outposts be easily supplied and easily reinforced. And these fortifications also serve as close kind of bastions of defense should you have to retreat from another fort. And the British really won't understand this way of fighting until 1758, when John Forbes decides to lay out a fort, every 50 miles or so on his way out to Fort Duquesne. So yeah, Johnson he's built Fort Lyman, which is right along the Hudson. And then from there, 14 miles to the northwest is the southern shore of Lake George. So there now he's going to build another fort. And then about 40 miles or so north of there will be Fort St. Frederick. So from there, you capture Fort St. Frederick, then there's another fort that can serve as a base of operations and springboard into an invasion further north down those lakes. Lake Champlain itself, if you're not familiar with this water highway system, the Hudson River, which obviously begins down by New York City, runs all the way up, which then connects towards Lake George via portage. And then from there, Lake George runs up into Lake Champlain, be a portage as well. There was a tiny river called the Lachute River that connects them, but it was really unnavigable at the time. So then from there, you go up or down Lake Champlain, you go to the Richelieu River. You're now in Canada. Ride the Richelieu River down to the St. Lawrence River, and guess what? There's Montreal and Quebec. So this is the major invasion route between Canada and the northern colonies during the French and Indian War, as well as during the Revolutionary War. So we'll see, Richard Montgomery is going to be using the same path while he's invading Canada in 1775 with Benedict Arnold as well. And then Guy Carleton the next year in 1776 is going to come down the same water path and stop short of Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. And then the following year after that, guess what? John Burgoyne is using the same exact invasion route into the colonies. So this is a very, very strategic and crucial waterway system that really whoever holds this key network essentially controls the continent. So that is why it was so crucial for in the early stages of this war for both sides to kind of jostle over Lake George and Lake Champlain, because if a war is declared, that's the invasion route. And that's why the Battle of Lake George is going to be so significant, because Johnson is going to be able to secure the southern end of Lake George. So while the French will be at the northern end, the British will be at the southern end.
One of the things that you touched on, which I think is was great for me, I've only dabbled a little bit into the study of the French and Indian War, and I think this will answer a lot of questions for our viewers tonight. Why are we talking, this battle in the fall of 1755 tonight? What's important about it? Not only did you lay out the importance for it as in regards to the Revolutionary War, but readers, as you go through Billy's book, you're going to see a lot of names that you'll be familiar with as folks that are constantly reading and learning about the Revolutionary War. One of which is going to be Israel Putnam. Another of which is going to be George Washington. We see time and time again some of the luminaries that will come to the forefront of American history during the Revolutionary War, gaining a lot of valuable experience during the French and Indian War. And what were some of the other future notaries, if you will, of Rev War fame that really get their experience with war firsthand during these campaigns in 1755, including Lake George?
Yeah, with the New Hampshire Regiment, there's going to be two notable individuals. One of them is Robert Rogers. This is before he starts Rogers Rangers. He will not be at the Battle of Lake George because he is actually ranging at the time with the New Hampshire Ranger Company with the regiment. They're going to be out in the woods. So they will not be at the lake while this battle is being fought. Same with John Stark, who is also part of this command. I think I read somewhere that Philip Schuyler as well was with the New York Regiment, which he probably would have been back at Fort Lyman at the time of the battle, if he was. And then two in the Northern Theater, now, of course, here's the Benedict Arnold hour. But in 1757, during the siege of Fort William Henry, after it falls, and the New England is mobilizing in case the French do proceed to move further into the interior, Benedict Arnold is going to form up with a local militia at 16 years old, and he's going to march to Fort William Henry. But by then, the time that his men get there, the French are already gone, so he'll retire, won't see any action.
For our longtime followers, you'll know that Billy cannot have a conversation without Benedict Arnold in it. You could ask Billy a question like, Billy, what do you think of the weather today? And he'll answer with something, well, it reminds me of this time. Similar weather that Benedict Arnold had. I don't want to go that far either. But no, I think that's one of the great things of your focus on not just the battle in your book, but these other campaigns, as you start to see how some of these campaigns will later shape some of the officers in the Revolutionary War. Just two decades later. But I want to get back to the narrative. We're getting close towards the end of the time tonight, and I really want to get to the battle itself. We've got Johnson's advanced elements. They've constructed Fort Lyman. The rest of Johnson's army has come up. He decides to take a vast majority of those men with him forward as they construct a new road towards the very southern end of the lake to build another fort, another established area, another established camp. He leaves, I believe you number maybe about 500.
500 to 600 or so behind.
At Fort Lyman. The rest of Johnson's men are up there. The fort is under construction up there. It's not a significant fort. I thought one of the interesting things is that Johnson holds not only a number of council of wars throughout the campaign, but he holds this council of war and asking them, his top-ranking officers, what kind of permanentability should this fort be? And Johnson was all about making the investment at that moment, making something that was a significantly sized fort with numerous emplacements for artillery, something that really could be a bastion. But he's outvoted, if you will, at the Council of War for something much less permanent. But regardless of that fact, they move ahead, they're starting construction. And on the flip side of the coin, intelligence has come in to the commanding French officer, and his decision is to make a counteroffensive against Johnson. Bring us up to speed with the French, the Canadians, and their Native American allies as they move towards Johnson's commands in the late summer, early fall of 1755.
Yeah, so just like the British determined that it was time to send regular troops to the colonies, the French government as well decided that it was time to start sending French regular troops to New France in Canada. So during the summer of 1755, a convoy of about 3,000 transports filled with 3,000 French regular troops are going to make their way across the Atlantic Ocean, and accompanying them is the new Governor General of New France, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, as well as the new General-in-Chief of all French regular forces in New France, the John Armand Baron de Dieskau. And what's interesting about this, talk about another future Revolutionary War individuals or notables, is this convoy too. The ships are going to straggle behind and they're actually going to be captured by a small British fleet under the command of Edward Boscawen. About 300 French regular troops are captured right there before they actually make it across the Atlantic. But the young captain who initiates the chase for these straggling transports is actually young Captain Richard Howe, who obviously goes on to command the Royal Navy in North America during the Revolution. But so what's left, they're going to arrive in Canada, and then Dieskau is going to rally as much Native American support as he can. He's going to have much more success than the British are. He's going to get them from the Great Lakes region, the St. Lawrence River Valley region, and then from there, he's going to mass them with Canadian militia, thousands of them, and begin marching towards Fort St. Frederick. So he'll arrive there first, and then immediately move down to the future site of what will be Fort Ticonderoga, there at Carillon, on the heights of Ticonderoga between Lake George and Lake Champlain. And from there, his scouts that are sent out. He's having a very difficult time getting cooperation from his Native American allies. They refuse to go out on scouting missions and perform even the simplest duties for him that might be expected. So he's going to rely on Canadian militia to gather his intelligence of where the British are at the southern end of the lake. And he's going to receive word that Johnson's army, which had been at Fort Lyman, has split, and that Johnson has moved on to the lake and he's left behind a much smaller force at Fort Lyman. So rather than going right after Johnson's main body, Dieskau is going to determine to attack this kind of isolated force, which consists of men from the 1st New York Regiment as well as the 1st New Hampshire Regiment. And he's going to then take a group of handpicked men, about 200, a little under 200 or so French grenadiers from the regiments of Lorraine as well as Languedoc. And he's going to take about 1,000 Native American auxiliaries and Canadian militiamen as well. And he's going to choose to move south along Lake Champlain to what's known as South Bay. Now, if you're not familiar with the geography, how big these lakes are, Lake George itself is over 30 miles long. Lake Champlain, well over 120 miles long. I believe it runs actually south a little bit past the northern terminus of Lake George. So South Bay is actually almost east of Lake George. And from there, South Bay, then you can move across to what's known as Wood Creek and use that waterway to penetrate even further into the interior beyond Lake George. So Dieskau is going to disembark his men at South Bay, but then rather than deciding to take Wood Creek, he's going to cut his own path to try to get to Lyman, which is going to be about a 30-mile route himself, a road that, he's building right there. And he's going to do this in quite some time. Only within days, he is right outside of Fort Lyman. And when he gets there, it's the eve of, or the evening of September 7th, so the night before the battle. And all of a sudden, his Native American allies are kind of going to get cold feet, and they're going to basically refuse to assault the fort. If you can even call it a fort, it's more like a crude stockade at this point, with one piece of artillery guarding the gate. But they don't know this. They think that it's actually manned by a dozen plus pieces of artillery, and the Native Americans will refuse to make a frontal assault against a fortified position that is defended by artillery. So Dieskau is going to have to call a council of war. He's going to fail in trying to convince them to proceed with the operation. So instead, he's going to give them an alternative. They can move back and attack Johnson's main encampment at the southern end of Lake George, and that is what they will then agree upon to go forward with. So the next morning, they're going to be on the road, heading up that military road that Johnson's force had constructed on their way to the southern tip of Lake George. Now, it's at this moment when a rider on horseback actually approaches the French lines from the direction of Johnson's camp, and he's shot dead, and this dispatch is taken off of him. And it is noticed from Johnson that he had received word from his scouts that the French, a large body of troops, had landed around the Wood Creek area, South Bay, and proceeded along their own road towards Fort Lyman. So he was trying to warn the officers in Fort Lyman that the French were heading their way. Well, now Dieskau is aware that Johnson knows of his presence, but he also knows now that Johnson's going to be trying to send a relief force of about 1,200 men, 500 Massachusetts men from the 3rd Massachusetts under the command of Colonel Ephraim Williams, as well as 500 men from the 2nd Connecticut Regiment under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Whiting, and then Chief Hendricks, about 200 or so Mohawk Indians are going to be this relief expedition going down the road, trying to come to the aid of Fort Lyman. So Dieskau is going to determine to lay a trap, and he'll set up an ambush along a ravine and tall bluffs overlooking the road. And he's going to put his militia on one side of the road, his Native Americans on the other, and put his grenadiers right at the end of the road, directly facing the approach. And he's going to give his men orders: do not fire until the grenadiers initiate this battle. Well, it's around 10:30 in the morning now, and this long column of Mohawk, Massachusetts men, and Connecticut men begin to approach the road with Chief Hendrick at the head of it and his Mohawks. And this is really a lot of the stuff, in colonial history. There's so many different variations of stories, and a lot of the stories you hear were usually by word of mouth, not necessarily primary sources of people who were there. So trying to piece together this part, which is known as the Bloody Morning Scout, is very difficult. But the widely accepted, account of what happened next is that Chief Hendrick begins hearing somebody yelling at him from the woods. And it's one of the French allied Native Americans. French had with them members of the Caughnawaga, which were cousins to the Mohawk who were allied with the English. So this Caughnawaga Indian basically is telling Hendrick to get out of here. Our feud is not with you, it's with the British. And then Hendrick tries to tell him that, well, our feud isn't with you either. How about we just get out of here and we don't have to worry about this? Well, a musket is ignited, shot rings out from where, still don't know. Who it was fired by, we don't know. But all of a sudden, then the woods are just a little blaze with musket fire. Hendrick, in the early stage of this fight, is going to go down. He's going to be pinned under his horse and stabbed repeatedly by bayonet. So obviously a French regular, most likely, a grenadier. And when that happens, now his Mohawk began to crumble. It's confusion. There's disorder. So now they begin falling back and taking a lot of the provincials behind them with them. Ephraim Williams, Colonel of the 3rd Massachusetts, in an attempt to rally his men, is going to climb a large boulder on the side of the road, and he's going to be hit in the head by a musket ball and killed instantly. So now the 3rd Massachusetts is falling back. And at the rear of the column, not yet exposed to any of the fire from the front, is the 2nd Connecticut under Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Whiting. And this is probably what I consider the decisive engagement of the Battle of Lake George, because Whiting here, rather than getting caught up in this rout, he's going to stand his men firm, try to rally anybody who would join his ranks, and now he's going to organize his men he's going to deploy them into the woods on both sides of the road and conduct a fighting retreat all the way back to the lake, where he's going to order his men to fire from behind every tree, behind every boulder, behind any piece of coverage that they can find to delay the oncoming French force as long as possible. And they're going to do so for about an hour before they finally break and make a run for the main encampment. And by this time, Johnson had heard the firing from 3 miles away or so where the battle's being fought, and he's going to organize the defensive line, basically felling trees. He's going to have about a 100-yard clearing in front of his line for a clear field of fire. He's going to turn over wagons or barrels, anything that they could use for cover to form as a breastwork. And now his men are taking position behind that and receiving the incoming men from the 3rd Massachusetts, the Mohawks, as well as the 2nd Connecticut. And here come the French regulars now forming in the military road to make a frontal assault. Keep going.
And yeah, so one of the things that you account is phenomenally well written is this fighting retreat that these guys do. And you argue, and I think successfully in the book, that this may be one of the first fighting, official fighting retreats.
Yeah, in a major pitched battle.
In a major pitched battle on the North American colonies. So it definitely is one of my favorite parts of the book. But they're fighting their way back, as you mentioned. Johnson's men have thrown up a defensive position, if you will. They're using trees as breastworks. They're rolling out the artillery. They're waiting for the New Englanders to fall back and basically get out of the line of fire before they open up. And this pitched battle then begins as the French and the Canadians and their Native American allies have arrived to Johnson's position. You mentioned moments earlier in the program that as the battle finally erupts at this point, Johnson goes down very early in the fight from a Forrest Gump wound of all things, right in the buttocks. He's down in the fight. And it's really his second in command that leads these men in steady combat. He keeps the men very steady, walking up and down the line, oftentimes in front of them to steady these guys. This is their really first experience in combat. As you write, many of them are green. And eventually, as the fighting goes back and forth, you talk about the Native American allies with the French start saying, this isn't the fight for us. They start falling back. The Canadians start falling back. But the battle is not done there. This rear guard action, that really comes out of nowhere, if you will. That Fort Lyman isn't out of the fight on this one. Tell us about the ending phase of the battle and what will become known as Bloody Pond.
Yeah, before I do move on to Bloody Pond, they close up the action there at the main engagement. And I think the thing that really helped out Johnson's men is they are fighting from behind breastworks. There's just a lot of measure of security there, as well as the only men who are actually making a direct assault on the breastworks are these 2 companies of French grenadiers. Once they get to the edge of that clearing, the Canadian militiamen, as well as the French allied Native Americans, refuse to go any further. So they're basically just going to be firing off pot shots from behind trees at the end of the clearing. It's the grenadiers who are going to form up first on the road and then charge directly into 2 of Captain Eyre's cannon that he had deployed there, and they're going to get mowed down with grape shot. And then from there, they're going to try to make an attempt, kind of work their way around towards the American right, but they'll fail in each assault against her. And it's during this action that another American officer is going to fall, and that's Moses Titcomb, commander of the 2nd Massachusetts, as the battle looks like it's won, and he's going to order his men over the breastworks to charge and gather up prisoners and try to capture anybody left behind. He's actually going to be hit as well by a bullet and killed. So the Americans, they lose 2 of the regimental commanders there, 2 well-respected regimental commanders from Massachusetts are going to fall in this battle. Another man to fall but survive is Baron de Dieskau, the French commander. He's going to be severely wounded and left behind on the field. It's not too often that you can look at a battle in history and see that the enemy general is captured, and not just a general commanding troops there. He was in command of all French regulars in North America, and he's captured during this battle.
There are very few times that I wince while reading military history. And, the story you tell is as he's lying there wounded on the battlefield, and one of the colonial forces comes up to him and believes that he has a weapon concealed under his uniform, and he fires point blank range into the guy's bladder. as you were describing that in the narrative, that is one of the few times that I've winced while reading, thinking about the
feel it
immense,
thinking about
yeah,
it.
the immense amount of pain that he must have been in. But ultimately, Johnson treats him very cordially, and while many of these other wounded officers survive, here's him with the wound in the bladder, the wound in the knee, the wound in the hip, that eventually survives those wounds. But a great part of the story. But let's go ahead and wrap up the fighting then. The details of the extended back and forth, and I think you did raise a good point that I may have lightly skipped over, is that this is an assault that is ongoing throughout the day. That these French regular troops, the grenadiers, are trying to break these lines that are set up.
Trying to hopefully find the weakest point that they can get through.
Right. And eventually it's just too much. They realize they're not going to take the position. And one of the decisions influencing that factor was the coming of darkness. The battle's been going on all day. The sun is starting to set. Their allies have already fallen back. They didn't go forward with them. But here comes reinforcements to kind of mop up the retreat of the French. Take us to Bloody Pond.
Yeah, so when it appears that the battle is now officially lost, Dieskau's second in command, Montreuil is his last name, he's going to order the men to disperse and try making their way back towards Wood Creek and South Bay, to then hop on the boats there and get back to towards where Ticonderoga will eventually be built. But throughout the day, the Canadian militia as well as the Native Americans with the French had been kind of pulling themselves out of the battle. They were done with it. They could see it wasn't going anywhere, especially the Native Americans. They didn't, cooler senses prevailed for them. They didn't want to risk getting themselves killed in this fight.
We're not their
yeah,
style.
Exactly. So they began retiring back towards the site of the Bloody Morning Scout that morning, where there was a lot of bodies still lying there, and for them a lot of plunder and scalps too, trophies that they could gather. So as darkness is now falling, reinforcements from Fort Lyman are finally coming out. Several hundred men under the command of McGinnis is his name. Men from New York, men from New Hampshire. They're going to be coming up the road, and they spot these Canadian militiamen and Native Americans around the previous battles fight scene, and they're going to ambush them. They open fire, and this is actually where the French army is going to take most of their losses, because the casualties were really only coming within the Grenadier Battalion during the main engagement. So for the British, their heavy losses come in the Bloody Morning Scout. For the French, it's this closing action. But yeah, what's known once existed a small pond off of what's today Route 9, there south of Lake George, about 2 miles from the southern shore. Supposedly these Frenchmen and Native Americans are ambushed. And those who were killed, that their bodies were by legend dumped into the pond, thus turning it into Bloody Pond. The pond most likely doesn't exist anymore today. There is a pond next to the road now that has a historical marker denoting it as the Bloody Pond, but that's most likely their farmer's pond, or one that was made there for commercial purposes. And it's just convenient to mark this as a Bloody Pond, because this is the one everybody's going to see as they're driving by on this major road in upstate New York. But after that, these reinforcements then move on towards Johnson's encampment, and that's going to really bring the Battle of Lake George to an end. It had been swirling for almost like 10 hours throughout the day, 9-10 hours, but it's finally over. Casualties are going to be about a little over 600 or so, is widely accepted. So this is a very bloody battle. I mean, just think Braddock's defeat, there was about 900 British casualties there, and that was the bloodiest battle fought on U.S. soil at that time, or what would become U.S. soil. And so this is quite bloody as well, not far behind that.
And you mentioned out of those casualties, one of the things that surprised me was the number of officer casualties.
Yeah,
was incredibly high for battles of this nature.
Yeah, no, they were right up at the front line. So that's definitely, we saw, Hendrick going down, Williams going down, just from being up at the front, trying to inspire these green troops, trying to lead by example that they would hold on to. And they're obviously successful in their efforts of doing so. But for Titcomb, for Williams, it's, cost them their life. And, but yeah, with 600 or so casualties, this is a very bloody battle at the beginning of the French and Indian War. Johnson is successful. The French had now retreated to the northern end of the lake. Johnson is going to finally get his permanent fortification there rather than a temporary one. He's going to order Captain Eyre to begin construction of what will be completed several months later and be christened Fort William Henry. And at the northern end of the lake, the French will begin constructing a permanent fortification as well, and that will be known as Fort Caroline, or what the English know as Fort Ticonderoga. So now, after 1755 is coming to a close, southern end of Lake George and the road to Albany in the water highway system all the way down to New York City is in British hands. So had Johnson's army been defeated there and Dieskau pressed on towards Fort Lyman, captured that, and then from there potentially moved on to Albany, that would have been an absolute death blow toward the British cause in the French and Indian War that early on, because the northern colonies would have essentially been cut off from the rest of the British colonies, and that could have spelled defeat and potentially, don't speculating with what ifs, but French conquest is a possibility because they would have had full control of everything they needed to continue throwing their military might into the colonies.
Well, before we let you go this evening, Billy, one of the last things that we want to mention to folks is the opportunity to go and visit this battlefield. The battlefield is preserved. You can visit this location. Tell us a little bit about visiting the Lake George Battlefield Park, some of the monuments and markers, which you cover in depth in the book, a great conclusion, if you will, kind of the memory and outcome of the battle and the development of the battlefield.
Yeah, the battlefield today, as Dan said, is widely preserved, where the main engagement was fought, as well as the site of the Bloody Morning Scout is marked. And I said Bloody Pond too, at least the pond or a pond in its general vicinity is marked as well. So you can actually follow all these major engagements of the Battle of Lake George. The park itself is state run. There is a battle monument there of Johnson and Chief Hendrick that was erected in the early 1900s, as well as tons of other monuments. Right next to it is Fort William Henry. So this is a case of really, history overshadowing history. Fort William Henry obviously gets all the attention over the Battle of Lake George, but Lake George is the battle that secures that ground for Fort William Henry to be constructed. And Baron de Dieskau's wounding and capture there opens the door for the Marquis de Montcalm to be promoted to commander of all French forces in North America, which obviously he is the one who captured Fort William Henry in 1757. But the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, who we've had on one of our revelries before to discuss their efforts and why their park is important. It's not just French and Indian War history. There's a tremendous amount of Revolutionary War history to take part on this ground as well. And they have just completed a new visitor center right there within the park boundaries. And they are hoping to get it open sometime later this month. If that's not possible, I would imagine sometime a little later this year. But that's really exciting because it's really going to be an open tool and resource for people to finally learn this story, where they don't have to just walk around and read an interpretive marker. They can actually have a visitor center with exhibits, artifacts that can interpret, this key moment in America's colonial history.
A key moment indeed. Our conversation tonight has been with historian Billy Griffith with Emerging Revolutionary War. The topic tonight, the Battle of Lake George, based on his book, The Battle of Lake George, England's First Triumph in the French and Indian War. Billy, I want to thank you so much this evening for spending some time with us and looking at one of the early moments and England's first triumph in what would become the French and Indian War. But before we let you go tonight, folks, want to give you some updates coming up with Emerging Revolutionary War events. First and foremost, our symposium on September 24th, 2022, again, partnering with Gadsby's Tavern Museum and the Lyceum in Alexandria, Virginia. It's going to be a day-long symposium focusing on the American Revolution. The theme this year, the world turned upside down, the American Revolution's impact on a global scale. Numerous speakers that day, many that we have had here on the revelries before, some others we haven't. Not going to want to miss out. Head on over to the emergingrevolutionarywar.org blog to pick up your tickets. Our ERW second annual bus tour coming up November 11th through 13th in the Rise of the American Army, Valley Forge, and the Battle of Monmouth. If you enjoyed listening to Billy tonight bring to life the Battle of Lake George, you are not going to want to miss him bring to life the Battle of Monmouth, as well as ERW historian Phil Greenwalt talking about Valley Forge. The big update here, folks, is we are down to 7 tickets left. So you do not want to miss out on this exciting tour, November 11th through 13th, with the historians of ERW at Valley Forge and Monmouth. Again, you can get your tickets. $175 per person, covers the Friday night talk, all-day tour Saturday, half-day tour Sunday, lunch on Saturday, transportation provided throughout the weekend. You can find those tickets at ERW. Not going to want to miss it. Last but not least, we hope to see you again coming up here in just 2 more weeks at our next Emerging Revolutionary War Revelry on May the 15th. We will have historian Sean Chick walk us through the Battle of New Orleans. It will be an exciting evening. And then the end of the month, May 29th, going to be a special night with John Adams of Liberty Cigars. For those of you that have been with us a long time, you know that the historians at ERW love a good cigar smoke on the battlefield and during our revelries. And we really enjoy the cigars that we get from John Adams and Liberty Cigars. We can't thank them enough for their support over the years and all the great smokes that we've had over the years, as well with John and out on the battlefield with historians and folks like you. So do join us for the upcoming 2 revelries on the 15th and the 19th, looking at New Orleans in 2 weeks, and a special evening with John Adams of Liberty Cigars on the 29th. Until then, folks, I'm Dan Welch, and thanks again to Billy Griffith. We'll see you again soon, if not on the battlefield. Take care.